The American Civil War, a conflict that tore the United States apart from 1861 to 1865, was the culmination of decades of simmering tensions between the northern and southern states. To understand why this devastating war occurred, we must journey back to the early days of the nation, when the seeds of division were first sown, the birth of a nation and the paradox of freedom. In 1776, the United States declared its independence from Great Britain, proclaiming that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yet, even as the Founding Fathers crafted these lofty ideals, a glaring contradiction lay at the heart of the new nation, the institution of slavery. While the northern states began to abolish slavery in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the southern states became increasingly reliant on enslaved labor to sustain their agrarian economy, particularly in the cultivation of cotton, tobacco, and other cash crops. This economic divide between the industrial North and the agrarian South created fundamentally different societies. The North embraced modernization, urbanization, and wage labor, while the South clung to a traditional, hierarchical, social structure built on the backs of enslaved people. These differences were not merely economic, they were cultural, moral, and political. As the nation expanded westward, the question of whether new territories and states would permit slavery became a flashpoint for conflict. The Missouri Compromise and the Wilmot Proviso. The first major crisis over slavery erupted in 1819, when Missouri sought admission to the Union as a slave state. At the time, the balance between free and slave states in the U.S. Senate was delicate, and the prospect of Missouri tipping the scales alarmed northern politicians. The resulting Missouri Compromise of 1820 temporarily resolved the issue by admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, while prohibiting slavery in the Louisiana Territory north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes parallel. This compromise, however, was a band-aid solution that failed to address the underlying tensions. In 1846, the issue of slavery in the territories resurfaced with the introduction of the Wilmot Proviso, a proposal to ban slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico following the Mexican-American War. Although the proviso never became law, it ignited fierce debates in Congress and highlighted the deepening divide between North and South. Southerners viewed the proviso as an attack on their way of life and their constitutional rights, while Northerners saw it as a moral imperative to prevent the expansion of slavery. The Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act. By the mid-19th century, the question of slavery had become so contentious that it threatened to fracture the Union. The Compromise of 1850, a series of legislative measures aimed at resolving the crisis, included provisions that both appeased and angered both sides. California was admitted as a free state, while the territories of New Mexico and Utah were allowed to decide the issue of slavery through popular sovereignty. The compromise also included the controversial Fugitive Slave Act, which required northern citizens to assist in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people to their southern owners. The Fugitive Slave Act was particularly incendiary. It outraged northern abolitionists and galvanized the anti-slavery movement. Stories of free black individuals being kidnapped and sent south under the act fueled northern resentment and deepened the moral gulf between the regions. Meanwhile, Southerners grew increasingly defensive, viewing any criticism of slavery as an existential threat to their way of life. The rise of abolitionism and the Southern backlash. The abolitionist movement, which sought the immediate end of slavery, gained momentum in the North during the 1830s and 1840s. Figures like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Beecher Stowe used speeches, newspapers, and literature to expose the horrors of slavery and rally support for its abolition. Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, became a cultural phenomenon, stirring the conscience of millions and hardening Northern opposition to slavery. In response, Southern leaders and intellectuals mounted a vigorous defense of slavery, arguing that it was a positive good rather than a necessary evil. They claimed that enslaved people were better off under the care of benevolent masters than they would be as free laborers in the North. This pro-slavery ideology, coupled with the South's economic dependence on enslaved labor, made compromise increasingly difficult. The Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas. The fragile peace between North and South was shattered in 1854 with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide the issue of slavery through popular sovereignty. This act, championed by Senator Stephen A. Douglas, was intended to ease sectional tensions, but instead plunged the nation into chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, each determined to sway the territory's future. The resulting violence, known as Bleeding Kansas, saw brutal clashes between pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri and anti-slavery free staters. The conflict reached a boiling point in 1856 when pro-slavery forces sacked the town of Lawrence, and abolitionist John Brown led a retaliatory massacre at Pottawatomie Creek. The bloodshed in Kansas foreshadowed the larger war to come, the Dred Scott decision and the breakdown of democracy. In 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court delivered a landmark ruling in the case of Dred Scott vs. Sanford Starr. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, had sued for his freedom on the grounds that he had lived in free territories. The court, led by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, ruled against Scott, declaring that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, were not citizens and had no rights under the Constitution. The court also declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, asserting that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. The Dred Scott decision was a devastating blow to the anti-slavery movement and a victory for Southern slaveholders. It further polarized the nation, convincing many Northerners that the federal government was under the control of a slave power conspiracy. The decision also undermined the legitimacy of popular sovereignty, as it suggested that even if a territory voted to ban slavery, the federal government could override that decision. The election of 1860 and the road to secession. By the late 1850s, the political landscape of the United States had fractured along sectional lines. The Democratic Party, once a unifying force, split into northern and southern factions over the issue of slavery. The newly formed Republican Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery into the territories, emerged as a powerful force in the North. In 1860, the Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln, a moderate who opposed slavery's expansion but promised not to interfere with it where it already existed. Lincoln's election in November 1860 was the final straw for many Southerners. Convinced that his presidency would lead to the eventual abolition of slavery, 7 Southern states, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, seceded from the Union between December 1860 and February 1861. They formed the Confederate States of America with Jefferson Davis as their president. As the nation stood on the brink of war in early 1861, the deep-rooted divisions over slavery, economics, and states' rights had become irreconcilable. The Civil War was not the result of a single event or decision, but the culmination of decades of conflict and compromise. By the spring of 1861, the United States was no longer united. The secession of 7 southern states and the formation of the Confederate States of America had created an irreparable rift. The election of Abraham Lincoln, a president who opposed the expansion of slavery, had been the catalyst for Southern secession, but the roots of the conflict ran far deeper. As the nation teetered on the edge of war, both sides prepared for the inevitable clash. The Civil War was no longer a question of if, but when. The fall of Fort Sumter. The first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter, a federal fort located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The fort, under the command of Major Robert Anderson, was a symbol of federal authority in the seceded state. When South Carolina demanded its surrender, Anderson refused, and Confederate forces, led by General P.G.T. Beauregard, laid siege to the fort. On April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter. After 34 hours of bombardment, Anderson surrendered the fort. The fall of Fort Sumter galvanized both the North and the South. In the North, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, while in the South, 4 additional states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, seceded and joined the Confederacy. The Civil War had begun. The Union and the Confederacy, strengths and weaknesses. As the war began, both sides assessed their strengths and weaknesses. The Union held significant advantages in population, industry, and infrastructure. The North's population of 22 million dwarfed the South's 9 million, including 3.5 million enslaved people. The North's industrial capacity allowed it to produce weapons, ammunition, and supplies at a far greater rate than the agrarian South. Additionally, the North controlled the majority of the nation's railroads and telegraph lines, enabling faster communication and transportation. The Confederacy, on the other hand, had the advantage of fighting a defensive war on familiar terrain. Southern leaders hoped that their superior military tradition and the determination to defend their homeland would offset the North's material advantages. However, the South faced significant challenges, including a lack of industrial capacity, a smaller population, and the moral and logistical complications of relying on enslaved labor to sustain the war effort. The First Battle of Bull Run. In July 1861, the first major battle of the Civil War took place near Manassas, Virginia, along a creek called Bull Run. Both sides were eager for a quick victory, and the battle was marked by a sense of optimism and naivety. Civilians from Washington, D.C. even picnicked on nearby hills to watch the spectacle, expecting a swift Union triumph. The battle began with Union forces, led by General Irvin McDowell, advancing against Confederate troops under General P.G.T. Beauregard. Initially, the Union gained ground, but Confederate reinforcements, including General Thomas Stonewall Jackson's brigade, turned the tide. Jackson's steadfast defense earned him his famous nickname, and the Confederate counterattack sent Union troops into a chaotic retreat. The First Battle of Bull Run was a humiliating defeat for the North, and a sobering reminder that the war would not be won easily. The Anaconda Plan and the blockade. Following the defeat at Bull Run, Union leaders began to develop a comprehensive strategy to defeat the Confederacy. General Winfield Scott proposed the Anaconda Plan, a strategy designed to strangle the South economically and militarily. The plan called for a naval blockade of southern ports to prevent the export of cotton and the import of supplies, as well as a campaign to seize control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two. The Union blockade, though initially porous, gradually tightened over the course of the war. By 1862, the blockade had significantly reduced the South's ability to trade with Europe, crippling its economy and limiting its access to weapons and other essential supplies. The Anaconda Plan would prove to be a critical component of the Union's eventual victory. The rise of Robert E. Lee and the Eastern Theater. In the Eastern Theater of the war, the Confederacy found a brilliant military leader in General Robert E. Lee. A veteran of the Mexican-American War and a former superintendent of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, Lee was initially offered command of the Union Army by Lincoln. However, Lee chose to side with his home state of Virginia, becoming one of the Confederacy's most formidable commanders. Lee's leadership was instrumental in a series of Confederate victories in 1862. In the 7 Days Battles, June 25th to July 1st, 1862, Lee successfully drove Union forces under General George B. McClellan away from Richmond, the Confederate capital. Later that year, Lee achieved another major victory at the Second Battle of Bull Run, August 28th to 30th, 1862, where his forces defeated Union General John Pope's Army of Virginia. The Battle of Antietam and the Emancipation Proclamation. Despite Lee's successes, the Union achieved a critical turning point in September 1862 at the Battle of Antietam. Following his victory at Second Bull Run, Lee launched an invasion of the North, hoping to win a decisive victory on Union soil and force the North to negotiate for peace. However, his plans were discovered, and Union General George B. McClellan intercepted Lee's army near Sharpsburg, Maryland. The Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862, was the bloodiest single day in American history, with over 23,000 casualties. Though the battle ended in a tactical draw, Lee was forced to retreat to Virginia, marking a strategic victory for the Union. The battle also provided President Lincoln with the opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory would be free as of January 1, 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation transformed the nature of the war. It shifted the Union's war aims from merely preserving the Union to also ending slavery, a moral cause that galvanized Northern support and discouraged European powers from recognizing the Confederacy. The proclamation also opened the door for African Americans to enlist in the Union Army, adding a new dimension to the conflict. The Western Theater and the fall of New Orleans. While the Eastern Theater saw a series of Confederate victories under Lee, the Western Theater proved to be a more successful arena for the Union. In April 1862, Union naval forces under Admiral David Farragut captured New Orleans, the Confederacy's largest city and a vital port. The fall of New Orleans was a significant blow to the South, depriving it of a key economic and logistical hub. Union forces also made progress along the Mississippi River. In February 1862, General Ulysses S. Grant captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee, opening the way for Union control of the river. These victories earned Grant the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant and established him as a rising star in the Union Army. The Battle of Fredericksburg and the Winter of Discontent. Despite the Union's successes in the West, the war in the East remained deadlocked. In December 1862, Union General Ambrose Burnside launched a disastrous assault on Confederate positions at Fredericksburg, Virginia. The Union suffered heavy casualties in a series of futile attacks against well-entrenched Confederate forces. The defeat at Fredericksburg was a demoralizing setback for the North and led to Burnside's replacement by General Joseph Hooker as 1862 came to a close. Both sides faced the grim reality of a long and bloody war. The initial enthusiasm and optimism had given way to the harsh realities of death, destruction, and hardship. Yet, the war was far from over, and the coming year would bring even greater challenges and turning points. By the end of 1862, the Civil War had evolved into a complex and multifaceted conflict. The Union had achieved significant victories in the West and had taken steps toward emancipation, but the Confederacy remained a formidable opponent, particularly in the East under the leadership of Robert E. Lee. As the war entered its third year, both sides would face critical tests of their resolve, resources, and strategies. By 1863, the Civil War had entered its third year, and the conflict showed no signs of abating. The Union had achieved some significant victories, particularly in the Western Theater, but the Confederacy remained resilient, especially in the East under the leadership of General Robert E. Lee. The war had already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, and the nation was weary. Yet, the coming years would prove decisive as the tide of the war began to turn in favor of the Union. The final chapters of the Civil War would not only determine the fate of the United States, but also reshape its future. The Battle of Chancellorsville. Lee's greatest victory. In May 1863, the Union Army of the Potomac, now under the command of General Joseph Hooker, launched a new offensive against Confederate forces in Virginia. Hooker's plan was to outflank Lee's army and force a decisive battle near the town of Chancellorsville. However, Lee, ever the master tactician, divided his outnumbered forces and launched a daring counterattack. The Battle of Chancellorsville, fought from April 30th to May 6th, 1863, was one of Lee's greatest victories. Despite being outnumbered nearly 2-1, Lee and his trusted lieutenant, General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, executed a brilliant flanking maneuver that caught Hooker's forces off guard. The Union Army was forced to retreat, suffering heavy casualties. However, the Confederate victory came at a high cost. Stonewall Jackson, one of the South's most talented generals, was accidentally shot by his own men and died of complications from his wounds a week later. Jackson's death was a devastating blow to the Confederacy and marked the beginning of the end for Lee's string of victories. The turning point, the Battle of Gettysburg. In the summer of 1863, Lee once again decided to take the war into Union territory. He hoped that a successful invasion of the North would force the Union to negotiate for peace and potentially gain foreign recognition for the Confederacy. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia crossed into Pennsylvania, and the Union Army of the Potomac, now under the command of General George G. Meade, moved to intercept him. The two armies clashed at the small town of Gettysburg from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863. The Battle of Gettysburg would become the largest and bloodiest battle of the Civil War, with over 50,000 casualties. The battle began with Confederate forces gaining the upper hand, but Union troops held key defensive positions, including Cemetery Hill and Little Round Top. On the third day of the battle, Lee ordered a massive assault known as Pickett's Charge, in which 12,500 Confederate soldiers advanced across an open field toward the Union center. The charge was a disastrous failure, resulting in heavy Confederate losses and marking the end of Lee's invasion of the North.